I grew up in a pretty poor household. When you grow up poor, you learn not to waste anything or take anything for granted. At least that's what I tell my wife, who's constantly nagging me to take care of my hoarding issues. Certain habits followed me even as I became an adult with a steady job. I still make sure to squeeze the last bit of toothpaste from the tube. I tend to ignore the expiration dates on my aspirins and Benadryls, and I still try to solve all my problems with duct tape that I dug out from the bins of a nearby hardware store. That, of course, won't clean up the garage full of junk I have, as Gina calls it. People think that dumpster diving is shameful or embarrassing, but that couldn't be further from the truth. I learned very quickly from a young age that people are inherently wasteful. Grocery stores throw out products that are close to their expiration dates. College move-out dates are treasure troves for TVs and organizer bins. I've accidentally come across rare jewelry from yard sales where families were tossing their dead grandmother's belongings. You get the picture. Just as a disclaimer, not everything you find in a dumpster is edible or even viable. Sometimes you get moldy fruits, blackened veggies, slightly opened bags of chips, mattresses with bed bugs, furniture beyond repair. And you just have to let those go. You eventually learn to differentiate between one man's trash and another man's treasure. But some things you find in dumpsters and on the streets have inexplicable origins. I've found some weird things in dumpsters that I've saved over the years and forgot about until recently. Now as I clean my garage up, I want to share some of the strange knickknacks that I've accumulated over the years, because I feel like this subreddit would appreciate them. I'll start with something that gave me nightmares for a week. Gina forced me into the garage and told me she wouldn't let me back in the house until at least a corner of the garage was completely Marie Kondo. Looking at the messy, cluttered garage gave me a headache, but I suppose it was a headache I started. I will admit, I do have a hoarding problem, and it was only made worse by years of accumulating things from various dumpster dives. I sifted through boxes and boxes of baseball cards, old sneakers, rollerblades, and raggedy clothes, all the while asking myself if any of these items brought me joy. The answer was no. Most of the items were pretty much junk that I thought would be useful at some point. After a few hours of sorting through stuff, I finally happened across something interesting. At the very bottom of the pile was an old, vintage Polaroid camera in its original packaging and everything. This one brought up a lot of memories: my first girlfriend Sally Herman, my first kiss, and my first breakup. I found this in '06, in a dumpster bin behind a local camera store. I snuck behind the store to scour through its bins out of sheer boredom and curiosity, and seemingly hit gold. Nestled in between black garbage bags was this Polaroid camera. It looked to be in good condition and was in its original packaging and everything. I figured this would be a nice birthday gift for Sally, who just so happened to be getting into photography at the time. To put the icing on top, a bunch of new film was tossed right next to the Polaroid. It was perfect, or so I had thought. Sally was ecstatic. She had been wanting a nice Polaroid for a long time. She didn't need to know I basically got it for free. She wanted to use it right away, so we drove to a nearby beach to take some nice pictures. "Charlie, look here." Sally quickly snapped a picture of me while the cold beach water lapped at my feet. I wasn't ready, I laughed. She pulled the film from the slot and began to shake it. "Take some of me," she demanded, pushing the camera into my hands. I snapped a few photos of her, with the ocean in the background. We took random pictures of the scenery. We even turned the camera and tried to squeeze into the small frame and take one together. This was a time before iPhones and selfies became ubiquitous, so we had to be creative. It would have been a great day, had the film not given us issues. "They're not developing." Sally's eyebrows scrunched up as she continued to shake the film. "Give it a few seconds." "I heard you're not supposed to shake it," I said. "You're supposed to keep it away from light, tuck it under your armpit." "Oh," Sally muttered as she put the Polaroid between her armpit awkwardly. We stood in silence for a moment before she took it out again, only to be disappointed by the blank film. "That's so weird." I brought the Polaroid closer to my face to examine it. It certainly seemed flawless, aside from the dented box I had found it in. Maybe there was something wrong with it after all. Looks like it's faulty merchandise. Where did you get this from? Sally asked. Maybe we can return it. Oh, you know, the camera store on the corner of Main and Maple. You mean Fred's Cameras and Imaging? Sally seemed confused. Charlie, that place closed down a few months ago. Huh? No way. I was just there yesterday. Yeah, Fred and my dad are buddies. He had to close the shop because of a rat infestation from the Italian place right next door. It's pretty much just an empty storefront. After a long conversation, Sally figured out that I didn't, in fact, purchase this camera, and I was forced to admit that I found this in the garbage bin behind the store. I lost my first girlfriend that day, and a bit of my pride. I gained a broken camera and the useful knowledge of never re-gifting dumpster finds to a girl ever again. The strangest thing was, I distinctly remembered seeing someone behind the cash register through the glass windows of the store. It wasn't Fred, but there was definitely someone there, and the store didn't look empty at all. In fact, it looked like it was still in business. I remember I had to be sneaky about going to the bins behind the store because I didn't want to be caught. But when I went back later that day, the store was indeed empty and the bins were completely barren as well. That was quite an unwanted trip down memory lane. I sighed as I dug through the Polaroid box for those pictures. After that disastrous state, I had stashed the Polaroid and the blank films into the box and shoved it where the light didn't shine. I never wanted to look at them again, but figured I may as well try to check if they had magically developed over the years, give myself something to laugh about and cringe over. The films weren't blank anymore. I did a double take, confused as all hell as I scanned the films. I knew my memory wasn't failing me. These films were blank when we checked on the beach, and they were most definitely blank when I shoved them into the box all those years ago. They were faded and dusty, but they were reminiscent of the pictures we took that day. The picture of me being caught off guard, pictures of Sally posing, the selfie of us. But they just weren't quite right. There was no ocean in the background. In fact, it didn't seem like we were at the beach at all. Instead, the films showed something strange. The picture of me caught off guard seemed blurred out, and all you could see was a vague silhouette against a hazy, burgundy-red background, almost like a sunset, even though we were at the beach on a sunny afternoon. I would have chalked it up to faulty film if it weren't for the fact that as each single shot of Sally progressed, her facial expressions began to look increasingly concerned. I distinctly remember her laughing for the photos, and the concerned expressions on her face in the photographs were beginning to send chills down my back. The selfie of us was more focused on a frowning Sally, with my face blurred out and to the side. All of the pictures were definitely from that day, yet they also weren't at the same time. I grabbed the Polaroid, turning it around to examine it from different angles. It looked just as new as it did when I gave it to Sally, save for the dust that had accumulated on the surface. I peered into the lens, shook it around a bit, opened the battery compartment. Nothing had changed. I pressed the button on the Polaroid in an attempt to see if it still worked, and to my surprise it actually began to print out a picture. But before I could put it down, more pictures suddenly spat out of the camera. I struggled to keep the pictures from haphazardly scattering across the floor as the Polaroid rapid spat out photograph after photograph. I figured maybe the camera was backed up on photos, if that was even possible, but after all this time, when no one had used it in years. The camera seemed to be on auto capture mode as it finally spent the last of its film, and I heard a strange winding down sound. The camera then shut down. I tried pressing the button again, but nothing happened. The pictures began to develop in my hands, and I held my breath as I saw what formed on the little square films. All the pictures involved Sally in some way or another. I tried my best to arrange the photographs in the way they were spat out. The first few films seemed relatively innocuous for a camera that just randomly spat out pictures I didn't take. They were all of Sally, but from perspectives that suggested she wasn't aware of the photographs being taken. One was of Sally at her college graduation, talking to her friends. One was of Sally waiting for the bus and staring off into the streets, another showed Sally playing baseball from a strange angle, and another was of Sally checking the mail in front of her childhood home. She looked somewhat upset and bothered in each photo. I immediately felt sick as I realized she wasn't aware in any of these photos that she was being photographed. It felt as though I was stalking her in some way. The next film showed a long, winding road with what looked like an older Sally standing in the middle of a long, barren road, again pressed against a hazy red background. Her facial expression was indecipherable. The next few films after that showed a cornfield, a near shot of a scarecrow, and a broken-down shed with a decrepit windmill looming next to it. There were only a few films to check after that, and even though I felt that something was terribly wrong, I pressed on. And I really wish I hadn't. The 9th film showed Sally sleeping on what looked like a haystack, with her hands and feet tied up and her mouth gagged with cloth. The 10th showed her awake and terrified, the flash of the Polaroid illuminating her features and accentuating her horrified eyes. As I got closer to the end, the photos became more and more erratic, with strange and shaky, blurry angles that suggested a struggle. The 13th and final film was what terrified me the most. The face of a washed-out man peered into the lens of the camera. A set of hollow eyes and a bulbous nose looked back at me from a strange angle that suggested whoever was behind the camera was taking a picture of himself. But his eyes seemed to go beyond the frame of the photograph and peered into my own, as if he was examining me, watching me, studying me. I threw the Polaroid down on the floor and immediately pulled out my phone to look up Sally on Facebook. With shaky hands, I scrolled through various Sally Hermans until I found one who remotely looked like Sally as an older woman. If what the pictures suggested was even remotely reflective of reality, she was in trouble. After I had moved away from my small town and started a family of my own, I fell out of contact with all of my old friends. As such, I had no idea what was going on with their lives. I decided this was worth reconnecting with an ex-girlfriend over, to try and figure out what these photographs were about, and to make sure she was okay. There were definitely sinister forces at play here. What I wasn't expecting, however, was for her Facebook profile to read, "Remembering Sally Herman." Countless posts littered her Facebook wall, saying things like, "You will be missed forever and rest in peace." Pictures of her and her friends smiling at graduation, of her playing baseball with her teammates, of her with a boyfriend in front of a cafe near a bus station, and her in front of her childhood home with her brother were displayed. This was most definitely Sally, and if it was, then the worst-case scenario had already happened. I began scouring the posts for any hints of what had happened. Was it a disease? A freak accident? Suicide, even? I turned to Google for the answer that I was so afraid to come to terms with. Sure enough, there was an obituary for Sally and various news articles about how she had gone missing one day, only to have turned up in an abandoned shack in the middle of nowhere. It was clearly ruled out as suicide and labeled as homicide. They found her in a body bag, with absolutely no signs of blunt force trauma, suffocation, or any other sign of a typical murder. Authorities suggested she may have died of shock, or perhaps of poison that had not turned up in the autopsy report. The article stated that the perpetrator was still on the loose, and that any evidence that could lead to the capture of the murderer would be rewarded with a hefty sum of money. I shut my phone off and shoved it back in my pocket, immediately leaving the garage and the Polaroids on the floor. I needed to gather myself and process everything that I had just seen. The shack Sally was found in looked exactly like the one in the Polaroid, next to the windmill that was falling apart. A picture of the road directly aligned with the Polaroid I had. Anyone with half a brain would have pinned the blame on me for having such questionable photos of Sally in the first place. And I would have had no actual, substantive explanation to give them. No one would have believed my story. I knew I had stumbled across something I wasn't supposed to see, and I also knew I had to get rid of everything. I damn near had a heart attack when I went back to the garage. My wife was picking the Polaroids off the floor, grumbling about how she always does everything in the house. I attempted to explain what they were and what had happened in the time she was gone. Gina looked confused, only stopping me to ask why I was freaking out over a bunch of blank Polaroid films. Sure enough, when she handed me the Polaroids, all the films seemed to be wiped clean of everything I saw. And look, I know I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I trust my memory, which is why when Gina asked if she could keep the vintage camera, I said no and immediately threw it out. I wish I could say that was the weirdest thing I've found, but there have certainly been weirder things I've come across. In the meantime, if you're going to dumpster dive, be careful and be picky, you never know what you'll find.